Welcome to the Crunch McDabbles Show. I'm your host, Crunch McDabbles. This is the only show where we break down the Pathfinder 2nd Edition rules into delicious and manageable morsels that you can pick up with a toothpick and shovel into your own gullet. Today's show, Slash and Cast builds. What is a Slash and Cast build? Well, it's a build that is designed to make some kind of physical attack, like a weapon attack, and combine it with some kind of magical spell, all in one round. It slashes and it casts. Why do this? Well, you're getting the best of both worlds. If you just made physical attacks, the second and third attacks in the round would have multiple attack penalties. And if you just cast spells, since they usually have 2 actions, you could only cast 1 per turn. So instead of limiting our build to one or the other, we instead combine them. Now we're getting 2 great attacks with no penalties each round. But is this actually a good thing to do? What does the math tell us? Let's break it down. Let's say I'm a first level champion. I have an 18 strength. I have a +7 to hit, and I attack an armor class of 17 with my longsword. My average damage on the first attack is 5.1. That's great. My second attack at -5 has an average damage of 3, and my third attack at -10 has an average damage of 0.9. You can see it's a pretty sharp decline as the multiple attack penalty increases. Now, instead of using these 2 actions down here with the multiple attack penalties to attack and dealing that 3.9 damage, I'm going to take those 2 actions and cast a spell. Let's see what happens. Let's say my champion casts an electric arc cantrip. I have a 16 charisma and trained proficiency with spellcasting, giving me a spell DC of 16. The average damage for the electric arc spell is 5.5 damage. And if I cast the spell against an enemy that has a +7 reflex save, would you look at that? It's 3.9. It's exactly the same. It's almost as if Paizo anticipated we were going to hack the system like this. Now, it's not always going to be exactly the same. In fact, most of the time the spell will end up being better than that, but it's hard to say definitively because there are a lot of factors that go into spellcasting. Those being, how good is your spell DC? How good are the monster's defenses against your spell? How much damage does your spell do? And do the monsters have weaknesses and resistances to those kinds of damage? The thing is, all those variables turn into our advantage. Let's take a look at it. First, while your physical attack is always against armor class, your spells are always against a reflex saving throw, a will saving throw, or a fortitude saving throw. Since it is a different defense, your target could always have a higher or lower saving throw compared to their armor class. The thing is, just about every monster has at least one of these defenses that is weaker than the others. At least one, sometimes 2 or more. So when you attack 2 defenses instead of 1, you are increasing your chances that one of your attacks might target a weaker defense, that one weaker defense. Essentially, you're getting a 2 in 4 chance instead of a 1 in 4 chance. Look at it that way. You also have a better chance of targeting monsters' weaknesses and overcoming their resistances. It works the same way. You're hedging your bet that for your 2 different attacks, that one of them would be a type of damage that the target has a weakness to, or that one of them would be a type of damage that the target doesn't have a resistance to. In other words, if I make 3 sword slashes against a skeleton, every one of my attacks goes against the skeleton's resistance to slashing. But if I make a sword slash and follow it up with my scattering scree cantrip, I might not have even been aware of the monster's resistance, but all of a sudden one of my attacks at least isn't affected by it. Second, and this is an interesting concept. Have you ever been at the table and you're rolling to hit and just aren't rolling well, but the wizard is over there making monsters make saving throws, and while his damage isn't incredible, it's much more consistent, because even on a save the monster is taking damage? This is the case where the wizard has a much, much higher chance to deal damage, even though his spell deals a similar average damage. Let's look at the champion attacks we made before. The second attack has only a 25% chance of hitting and dealing damage, and the third attack has only a 5% chance of hitting and dealing damage. So the chance that one or the other hits and you deal any damage at all is around 29%. But the spell with the saving throw deals half damage on a save, which means they only take no damage when they critically save, which is on a 19 or a 20 on the dice. This means you have a 90% chance that the spell deals some damage. And look at the difference. This one has a 29% chance to deal damage, and this one has a 90% chance to deal damage. But the average damages are similar. And the final reason to make a slashing caster, it is just a really interesting build. Maybe you want a champion undead hunter that wants to pray to their deity and disrupt undead all day. Maybe you want to make a Tempest Ranger that embraces the storm in a flurry of twin takedown attacks that move so fast they generate electric arc electricity damage when he attacks. You could even flip this the other way and have your spellcaster like a cleric or witch or sorcerer make an attack and cast a spell and leverage that good spell DC with the less than optimal attack to get a pretty similar result as the martial. I mean, there's just no limit to the cool character concepts that you can use this idea with. So how do you make this work? Well, let's start with the spell. Basically, you need two things to make your spell work. You need a spell to cast, and you need a spell DC as high as you can get. Getting a spell and a high spell DC looks like this. If you're a caster, that would be any of these classes here. You are going to have the spell casting ability right at first level and train proficiency in spell casting and a spell DC that goes up to legendary and a class ability that is tied to your spellcasting proficiency. In other words, these guys are all set for the spellcasting side of this. The Summoner and the Magus are pretty good as well. They start with spellcasting and cantrips and train proficiency, but they have a different spell DC progression that only increases to master proficiency. And for the Magus, their class key ability, it's not their spellcasting ability. Then over here we have all the other martial classes. They don't start with the spellcasting class feature, so these classes would have to get the ability to cast spells from somewhere outside of their class. There are two ways to do this, either with innate spellcasting or with an archetype spellcasting. Innate spells are interesting. You can get these from your ancestry or, in a rare case, from your background. Innate spellcasting uses your charisma as its ability modifier, so you're going to want as much charisma as you can get on your character. And innate spellcasting gives you trained spellcasting proficiency. Now, it seems like we'd be all set here with innate spellcasting, but we have a problem. The spellcasting proficiency never increases beyond trained proficiency on its own. Innate spellcasting only increases if you have some other spellcasting that increases. And if you don't have that, then you're just trained proficiency forever. So this is where it is interesting to point out that the monk and the champion, while they don't have the spellcasting class feature, they do have a spell DC, and that spell DC increases automatically in the class features. It follows the same progression as the Magus and the Summoner, so these two belong over here. And what that means for the monk and the champion, if they had innate spells, the spell DC for those spells would increase at the same progression as the Summoner and the Magus, which is pretty decent.
So everywhere where the Ranger's class DC increased before, now if you have a Warden spell, it will also automatically increase the spell DCs as well.
So your monk or your champion could run around never having a spellcasting class feature, but still having a really decent attack cantrip from their ancestry. Also, as long as we are here, the monk has Key Blast, so they can get a focus spell that would work great with the slash and cast build, and they can get that right in their own class feats. Okay then, for everyone else over here, what are we supposed to do? Well, we need a spellcasting archetype. The dedication feats get you trained spellcasting proficiency and some cantrips. Then, to get beyond trained proficiency, you need to take the basic spellcasting feat, and then the expert spellcasting feat, and then to increase to master proficiency, you need to take the master spellcasting feat. That is a lot of feats. If you are using the free archetype variant rule, this isn't a big deal, but if you aren't, This starts to dominate your build and doesn't leave room for your own class feats, which, depending on the build, a lot of times a class really needs their own class feats to be great. At that point, you really have to consider if it is worth it. You might be giving up way too much power in your own class to get the ability to cast spells, so you just have to make sure this works for you. Now, let's look at the other side of the equation, our weapon attack. The key to making a good slashing caster is finding a great single action attack. And this is challenging in Pathfinder 2e. Most of the great physical attacks are two actions, like the power attack, or the spell strike, or the swashbuckler finishing moves that require an action to get into panache. So let's look at what's out there. The most basic single action attack that everyone can do is a strike action. Nothing fancy there, just spend an action and attack. This works great if you can get some extra damage added into the strike. This could be the barbarian's rage damage, the rogue's sneak attack damage, the champion's blade ally. Anything in your class that can pack a wallop into your basic strike is going to be great. There are a few single action attacks that let you make 2 strikes for 1 action. This is a great option. The monk has flurry of blows and the ranger has twin takedown. You're going to have a multiple attack penalty on the second attack, but you're making 2 attacks and casting a spell, so that's pretty darn nice. There are some single action attacks that add in extra effects with the attack instead of damage, and these are worth considering. A fighter snagging strike, for example, could make the target flat-footed, which would benefit other people in the party, but wouldn't really help out with the spell you're about to cast. The United Assault feat could work pretty good. This is from the Knights of Lasswall book. It adds in some circumstance damage on your hit. Also, combat assessment from the fighter is an interesting choice. This lets you recall knowledge with your attack, and since you might have a decent mental ability score, this could work pretty well for you, and it will help you discern which magical attack to follow up your weapon strike with, without adding in any actions. You have to be careful with a lot of the single action attack feats, because a lot of them have the press trait. The press trait means you can only use the attack if you have a multiple attack penalty. Well, we're purposefully trying to avoid the multiple attack penalty with this build, so those aren't going to work for us. We don't have the actions anyways. You also might consider feats that make your attack better rather than just specific attacks. The rogue feat Brutal Beating, for example, is an interesting option if you're in the ruffian racket and you're a rogue. And if you critically hit with your attack, the target is frightened 1. So then you're going to follow up with your spell, and they're going to have a -1 on their save. So that works pretty good together. So let's get to advanced concepts. How do we kick this thing into overdrive? Let's look at some examples. The monk and the champion really stand out here. The monk has flurry of blows right away at first level, giving them that great single action attack, and they have spellcasting proficiency in their class features, which gives them that sweet spellcasting DC. At level 6, the monk can add in the Key Blast focus spell, which is a darn nice DC spell to have. Instantly, you are a smash and cast build at 6th level. Now, it would be nice to add in an innate cantrip to your monk, such as adding an electric arc cantrip from your ancestry. Unfortunately, the monk spells are based on wisdom, but the innate electric arc cantrip would still run off your charisma, so one of those 2 spells would be a little behind the other. Regardless, when it is broken down, the monk Key Blaster is pretty great. The flurry of blows more than carries the load, and once the Key Blast kicks in, you start to get a lot more damage out of the spell side of things. 41.6 total damage. That's great. Even though the champion doesn't have a built-in damage spell like the monk, it might be a little better for this. The champion has that great built-in spell DC, and any innate spell runs off your charisma, which is an important ability for most champions, particularly paladins. So that's going to work nice. A great champion build idea might be the Scion of Slayer's background. This is the only background I think that comes with a cantrip. You get the Disrupt Undead cantrip. You take the Shining Oath at level 2, and now you're the Scourge of Undead in all the land. You could add in an Electric Arc or Dazed Cantrip with an Ancestry feat and be running around as a slashing caster right out of the box at level 1. And, well, that's what happens when you don't have a great single action attack. This is missing some damage from the Radiant Blade Spirit at level 10. Maybe a Retributive Strike here and there would add in some damage. I still love Paladins. If you have to multiclass into a spellcaster, Druid is by far the best option to gain a damaging spell. You can grab the Tempest Surge focus spell and drop electrical bombs on your enemies that deal a d12 per spell level damage. You could drop that at least every combat. That'd be nice. How about making a Tempest Ranger that splashes in a little Storm Druid to make those 2 twin takedown attacks, and then follow it up with one of those big dongers? Also, since you are a Ranger, you can add more focus points in your class and add extra focus points when you refocus from the Warden Focus and Warden Wellspring feats, which those feats are going to be changed at the end of the year in the remaster project, but for now, you could grab those feats. And wow, that is solid damage right there, even with that pretty weak Electric Arc to start out with. Look at how huge those damage numbers are for the Tempest Surge spell. Here is an interesting one. The Barbarian has that incredible single action attack when they are raging, but unfortunately they can't cast a spell that has a verbal component, which is just about all spells. So is the Barbarian excluded from the slashing cast? Heck no. What if we archetype our Barbarian with an Oracle? The Oracle has a bunch of single action focus spells that don't have the verbal component. So our Giant Instinct Barbarian can cast Soul Siphon or Tempest Touch and then make those 2 big attacks. That's going to be really nice. And that is a pretty interesting class combination. I think that'd be a lot of fun. 56.2. That's a lot of damage, Phil Swift. And sure, it's 2 giant rage damage attacks, but that Tempest Touch damage is no slouch either. Now, it's not just martial classes that are getting in on this. Of course, sorcerers and clerics, they have some interesting attack and spell combinations. But what about the wizard? How about this? Make a Universalist wizard, drop a Hand of the Apprentice focus spell, and then follow it up with a nasty, nasty spell with the spell DC. That becomes a pretty ridiculous combination because the Hand of the Apprentice spell is going to use your intelligence and spellcasting proficiency to hit. So hey, why is that wizard carrying them all around? Bang! That's why. Well, sure, that's not bad. You're missing a lot of damage on the weapon attack with no item bonus to hit and no crazy weapon specialization. I still like that one. Okay, final build, and this one is the craziest and the best. Take an Alchemist Bomber, max out your intelligence and your dexterity up to 16. They get the Quick Bomber feat at level 1 that gives them a great single action attack. Then take the Witch archetype. Your spells are based on your intelligence now, which you have a maxed out stat for, which makes you a +1 better than all those other marshals at your spellcasting DC. Drop your focus point on the focus spell that adds elemental damage to a target of an element that you choose. Sustain that spell as a free action with Cackle, and then nail the target with an Electric Arc cantrip and a Bottled Lightning, adding in that elemental weakness twice in a turn, not to mention all the splash damage all over the place. Then, at level 9, just take Multi-Talented and add in an Oracle level, switch everything over to fire damage. This thing starts to go berserk. The Alchemist is really the king of auto damage with all that splash damage. And that is it. That's why you listen to the Crunch McDabble Show. I've been your host, Crunch McDabble. Survive Galarian by adding some slash to your cast, or get some cast with your smash, whatever you need to do. Now, instead of using these 2 actions, which means they only take damage when they critically save. Daze works fine, a little less damage, but it has a chance to stun targets. Disrupt Undead is great against dragons, I'm sorry. Obviously, Disrupt Undead works against dragons. Undead, I'm sorry. Disrupt Undead works against Undead. I always get that mixed up. There are two parts to our spell DC, spellcasting proficiency and spellcasting ability modifier. Now for the spellcasters, this is easy. You have a maxed out ability modifier from your class, and you have the best spellcasting proficiency that goes right up to legendary proficiency at level 19. Not the War Priest, they suck. But for every other caster, you're going to have plenty of spells and the best spell DCs. And that is it. That's why you listen to Crunch McDabble's show. I've been your host, Survive Galarian, with some magic and some might, with some slashing and with some casting.